Well, welcome everyone. This is the first episode of Econ Chat with Bob and Zvi. I'm Bob Lerman, an economist who works at Urban Institute, works on public policies, mostly domestic policies, and have a long friendly relationship with my buddy, who's going to be my partner on these chats, Zvi Bodie. Zvi, who are you?
Okay, I'm Bob Lerman's buddy, and we should say we're Meir Kohn's buddies as well. Meir is the inaugural guest on our podcast. Or I guess it's more than a podcast, it's a webcast. And we got into this because we found that we enjoyed listening to other people's webcasts. In particular, who was the last one that we listened to?
Russ Roberts on Econ.
Right, but there are many. This seems to be a trend. And we want to, be cool.
Yeah, and well, thanks, Zvi. And we are delighted to have Professor Meir Kohn of Dartmouth College to be our first guest. Zvi and I have known Meir since the 1970s. And
the 70s, right.
Zvi first met Meir. Where did you first meet, at Hebrew U or at MIT?
At MIT.
We first met as MIT grad students. I first met Meir working at Brookdale Institute in Jerusalem, and we've all been friends ever since. But also we're admiring Meir's work, and we want to talk about that today. So Meir, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be your inaugural guest.
Thank you. So we wanted to start out by talking with you, and we view this as a conversation about your new book that's been in the works for a while.
Yes.
That both is quite intriguing because it lays out a new theory of economic growth, but built on very elaborate descriptions of economic history. So why don't you tell us how the two kind of converge?
Okay. Well, when I met Zvi at MIT, I was a mathematical theorist, and that's what I did. That was my thesis, and I continued working in mathematical theory when I went back to teach in Israel. There was a bit of inflation starting up in Israel then, so I got interested in monetary theory, and that's what I worked on mainly. I found that the models of money that I sort of looked at seriously at that time I thought they were pretty unsatisfactory. And I tried to develop better models of money. But after quite a few years, I was doing this for maybe 10, 15 years. I was working on mathematical monetary theory. I just got sick of it. I just decided I really wasn't learning anything from it whatsoever. It's kind of an early midlife crisis. And at that time, I was writing a textbook on financial institutions and markets. When I came to MIT, they had me teach a course on money and banking. I couldn't teach mathematical monetary theory to undergraduates, so that's what they gave me to teach. And I actually got interested in the financial institutions part of that, the banking rather than the money. And I then changed the course into a financial institutions and markets course and wrote a textbook for it.
This is at Dartmouth or?
At Dartmouth. No, this
Yeah.
is Dartmouth.
Okay, yeah.
And when I was doing that, I read some financial history. And I thought it would sort of make it more interesting for students to read. And what I found was not only was the history interesting, but it was incredibly informative. I learned way more from the history than I'd ever learned from any mathematical model. So this was sort of my big epiphany. Then I thought, okay, so I'm looking for something new to do. How about doing a history of financial institutions and markets, more or less from the beginning? And the beginning, I decided, would be sort of pre-industrial Europe. And I started working on this, and I found that the thing that was really interesting about finance, financial institutions and markets, is what difference do they make? So what? Who cares? Okay. And that's kind of led to mission creep, and I got interested in other things, in sort of economic progress in general, what role they play. You can't avoid thinking about governments. So I did, I read quite a lot about governments. I just spend a lot of time, reading and thinking and sort of putting material together. And in the end, the form that the book took was really a theory of economic progress in general, including economic and political aspects. And it did answer my original question about what difference finance makes and why we should care. So that was good. And so that's what I've been doing. And it sort of develops more and more. They say that Rome wasn't built in a day. And this book, I think, is taking longer than Rome.
Well, I want to get back to Rome later on.
Okay, all right, that's fine.
Because one of the interesting issues from my perspective, I'm also a student of history,
yes,
and financial history in particular. And so one of the big questions is, why did we go into the Dark Ages in the West?
Okay.
And what was happening in the East? Because I know that you have studied the China.
Yes.
Of China. So we got to there are a lot of interesting topics to discuss, but I would start by asking, who in the great economists do you identify your approach most closely with? Is it Adam Smith?
Well, there's a certain, I think sort of that's certainly true. But I've read a lot of things. I've spent a lot of time before working on economic theory and reading stuff. And I've been influenced by a lot of different people. And just the method that I have employed, I should say something about that, because what I've been doing isn't history. What I've been doing is theory. Okay. But I've been doing theory in a different way. Okay, and Ed Lima, who sort of works in the same way, describes it as a method of patterns and stories. Okay, so you look at the evidence, at the material, whatever it is you're interested in, the economy, a part of the economy, whatever it is, and you just look, you don't go with too much presuppositions. I mean, you do have stuff in your head, obviously. And you see, what do you see? And what do you see means sort of distinguishing patterns in the evidence that you're looking at, okay? And then the stories come in to explain the patterns. Why do we see these patterns? And the stories sometimes kind of suggest themselves. Sometimes they're in your head from different things you've learned about economics and different parts of economics. And then you try and weave that together into a theory. Okay, that's where you get your theory.
That's really how I would characterize Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations.
Yes, I mean, it's not a new, I think classical economics, or some of it, I mean, there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of historical.
This patterns and stories is very much
Right.
The method.
I constantly refer back to his description of the Bank of Amsterdam.
Yes.
And it's, as a 100% reserve bank, or a narrow bank, and that was the reason it survived. There was never a crisis, a banking crisis.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get into the history a little bit, because I have read a good part of your book.
Yes.
And one of the things where you seem to depart from a lot of the conventional wisdom is that conventionally people see a kind of very flat economy from almost the year zero to the year 1600 or so, maybe even into 1700.
Yeah.
And then this big uptick with the Industrial Revolution. Whereas you have a somewhat different story.
Right.
Can you let us,
I think your
listeners, what your story is?
That's sort of the conventional story. It's mainly the conventional story for people who haven't studied that period. Okay, people who have studied that period say, no, nothing like that. There were all kinds of ups and downs through the process, throughout economic history.
What year are we beginning at? What year are you really?
I'm beginning maybe 1100, something like that.
Okay.
So,
That raises my question about the Roman Empire.
Okay, well, again, this isn't, I mean, I've read it. I wanted to know what happened before, so I read some about that. And it fits in very well with my pattern of, so what kills economies is the political stuff, the governments, okay? So what happened in the Roman Empire was total fiscal and monetary collapse, okay? There was sort of increasing civil conflicts within the Roman Empire. Their fiscal model kind of exhausted itself. It's interesting, their fiscal model was conquering new territory and financing their wars with the proceeds. Okay, it was kind of a self-financing thing. It wasn't sort of taxing Rome. It was, they were actually giving stuff to the Roman, plebs and all this kind of thing. So and that was very popular. I mean, that was good. Okay, you weren't raising waves, but they eventually ran out of good places to plunder. So their fiscal means were limited. There were other limitations to their fiscal possibilities. And they just had this sort of political crisis within the empire, lots of civil wars, a little bit from the outside, not enough money. So they resorted to inflation, to debasement. Okay, they destroyed the currency. They destroyed the economy with that. In the 4th century, the end of the 4th century, they really had to go over to what I call a tribute economy, where they collected tribute in kind. Okay, they couldn't tax anymore. There was not a monetary economy any longer. And it was downhill from there. They just blew up. Okay, that was the end. The barbarians just walked in. It wasn't destroyed by the barbarians invading Rome. No, they wouldn't have, like 200 years earlier, they wouldn't have been able to invade Rome. Rome collapsed of its own sort of political predicament.
Not unlike maybe the Soviet Union, but anyway.
Not unlike in China, you see that over and over again, that pattern.
But let's get to 1100, where a lot of your writing begins.
Yeah,
1200.
So that's the period I look at was from 1100 to maybe the mid 17th century. Okay, so pre-industrial, I don't call it pre-industrial, I mean before the Industrial Revolution. Okay, that's really what I'm looking at. And as in the Dark Ages, things started to recover around 800. I mean, it wasn't, but they hadn't recovered that much by 1100. And then there was something called the Commercial Revolution, which was sort of a really significant period of economic progress in some parts of Europe. Okay.
The city-states, right, of Italy, right?
Sorry?
The city-states?
Yeah, of northern Italy, and a little bit in northwest Europe as well, in sort of the, yeah.
So again, I want you to contrast this notion of a flat period up until the Industrial Revolution,
Right,
with what you've seen, maybe other historians have
okay,
too.
so
But you actually explain why these ups and downs.
yeah. And again, I'm not the first. I was sort of a seminal thing that I read was Eric Jones' book, Growth Recurring. Okay,
Growth
so
Recurring?
Growth Recurring, yeah. So he also looked at history. He'd written a book on the Industrial Revolution and talked about, I think maybe it's called the European Miracle or something like that, this unique European thing, okay? And then he read more history, in different parts of the world, and he saw, no, it wasn't unique. He identifies Sung China and Tokugawa Japan as other sort of similar economic miracles, okay? And he said what was unique in Europe was not that there was sort of rapid economic progress, and it happened in Europe before. The commercial revolution was pretty rapid economic progress. What was unique about the Industrial Revolution is that it continued, that it wasn't ended in the way that all these other things ended. That's the trick, okay?
Well, what was the cycle? Say in 1100.
The elevator version of my theory. So we'll have a framework for discussion, okay? So economic progress is about commerce and predation. Commerce is the accelerator, predation is the brake, okay? Commerce interacts with production, which is what economists generally think about. They don't really think about either commerce or predation. They focus on production. But in fact, it's the interaction of commerce with production that generates economic progress. And if that was the whole story, we'd all be rich. Okay, that just is a self-perpetuating process, goes on and on. Nothing unusual in that respect about the Industrial Revolution, okay? It doesn't go on and on because of predation, okay? And predation is very closely related to government. Okay, there are sort of two basic types of government. One type I call predatory government, which you'll see for obvious reasons, is created for the purpose of predation. Okay, it's a group of armed men take over a territory and collect tribute from the population. Okay. It isn't a social contract or anything like that. It's just, Olson called it a stationary bandit. Okay, it's banditry. Okay, that's the most common form of government to this day. Most of the governments in the world fit that rather well. Okay, there's another form of government, which is actually commercial government. It comes out of commerce. It was generally the government of commercial cities. Commercial cities were populous enough and wealthy enough to have a realistic chance of protecting themselves against predatory governments. And they set up their own governments to organize their defense. Okay, so this is the other type of government, which I call associational government. It's bottom up. It's what we think of as, like our government sort of fits that category. Okay, but it's a rarity. Historically, it's a rarity. Okay.
But Meir, where does the emphasis that many economists put on property rights and the ability to enforce property rights to be stable and be able to use that as a framework within which
well, enforcing property rights is a pretty small problem. Okay, hunter-gatherers were pretty good at that. Okay, if you took someone's stuff, they whacked you over the head. Okay, property rights really worked. And it was supported by the other members of the clan or tribe or whatever it was, because it was in everyone's interest that property rights be respected. Actually, my dogs are pretty good at property rights. Okay, so it's natural, it's evolved. It's not a really big deal. Okay, the real property right is property right against government. That's a problem, okay? Because that's overwhelming force. By yourself, you cannot protect yourself against the government's plundering you, okay? So when we talk about establishing property rights, and you know, in the literature, that is true. When they talk about 1688 and all this, it wasn't that people were worried about highway robbers and this solved the problem. People were worried about the government taking their stuff, and the form of government changed in such a way that that was no longer a big worry. Okay, so those are the property rights. So it's not that the government needs to be there to protect us from each other. That's a non-problem. Okay, the government has to be such that we don't need protection from the government.
Now, what about wars?
Yes. Okay. So, you know, we talk about these big breakdowns. Wars have a lot to do with that. Okay. And what I learned, again, from my reading of history, and I see I also studied China, by the way, as in order to test my theory, is wars are usually what put these periods of growth, end these periods of growth. And it's not the destruction of war, generally. They were more destructive in China. In Europe, they were, until pretty recently, they were very small scale things. Okay, they would count today as a minor demonstration, not as a war. But the funding of wars is what destroyed economies. Okay, it's the government predation to fund their wars. Okay, which was highly destructive and sort of killed things off. So that's sort of the typical story.
So you observe these patterns from 1100 and let's say
the things I've been describing, you see much earlier than that. Yeah, I mean, I read about the Rome and the Roman Empire, and even before that, and these sorts of things. And those are sort of the recurring patterns. I've studied China, and that's exactly what you see happening there. Okay, so China's have a period when you have a good government. Okay, when you have it's usually a good government, it's usually associational, but sometimes it can be a predatory government, which behaves well. I mean, that does happen sometimes. And then you get a period of economic progress, and then, you know, wars.
So you define good as a government that's not too predatory?
Essentially, yeah, economic freedom. I mean, there are a few more dimensions. The Chinese government did a lot of damage, not just with what it took, but the regime it put in place to control the country and to enable it to take what it needed. So
expand on that.
China, the classic Chinese government, of which communism is actually a modern example, to keep its hold, it did two things which kind of kill the economy. One of them is it suppressed commerce. Okay, not good. Not good. Okay, so they had a command economy, okay, which, you know, could do certain things and couldn't do others, but economic progress it didn't do. And the other thing the Chinese banned was any kind of voluntary association. Okay, so for an economy to function, and particularly for commerce to function, it's very important that people can associate and organize things and do things that they need. Okay, so just as an example, in China, formal order, law, courts were a really big problem perpetually. The government legal system was useless for commerce and finance and these sorts of things. But in Europe, the government courts and things like that were not terribly useful either. But commerce was able to develop its own courts, its own formal order, okay, which was exactly what was needed. Okay, so the big commercial cities, London and Amsterdam and Antwerp, and the Italian city-states when they were existed, they developed formal order. And when the government had commercial courts, they essentially took over the commercial law from these commercial courts, okay, and did function reasonably well. In China, none of that could happen because the government didn't allow merchant associations that would have done that. That's just an example. There's all sorts of other things. So it's not just taking stuff that can kill the economy. Okay, the regime that you set up to enable you to take stuff can do a lot of damage just by itself. Okay, and you see that very clearly.
Now, again, trying to, I note that you run these reading groups.
Yes.
That's for students, or do you have faculty involved as well?
Sorry. Yeah. No, they're led by a faculty member.
So it's you,
Yes.
one other faculty member, or several?
No, it's
others?
just me. Different faculty members lead different groups. There are like 3 or 4 of us who do it.
Reading groups on various
Yeah,
topics.
there's a book, and we assign a chapter, and I think other people as well, but I always sort of send a list of questions ahead of time, sort of to focus. And that's the first half, and then the second half they have to bring questions, and we discuss it.
So, Meir, have you used your own book?
No, and I actually tried to teach a class, and it's not a good book for this purpose. I found for a reading group, you need a book that is really interesting, but there's problems with it. So there's something to discuss. Okay. And it has to be reasonably limited. So my book is way too much for like, we usually meet 5-6 times in the term.
Yeah, I noticed on YouTube that you were discussing some book called, what was it, Productivity or?
Power of Productivity.
Yes.
Yeah, it's funny. That's one of the closest things to my work. Okay, it comes to quite a few of similar conclusions. He also, the key is—
years ago, the group head of McKinsey, who had experience in various parts of the world.
Yes.
And
well, they did what I did. Okay, so although they did it from the beginning, with me it sort of developed, but they wanted to understand economic progress. Why are some countries rich and other countries poor? And they thought, as consultants, a good way of doing that is to go and have a look. Right? They didn't start building models. Okay, they went and they had a look. What do we see? What seems to be the differences? What's going on? So it's patterns and stories. And 2 of the big conclusions are commerce is really important. Okay, so things that handicap commerce are a big problem. And predation is the killer. Okay, government is usually—
they use those terms?
No, he talks about retail and government. I mean, he doesn't talk about commerce. And I mean, he just looks at retail as the thing that he observes.
Yeah.
You've done other books as well?
Yeah. Next term we're doing Seeing Like a State by James. Scott. Yeah. We do Jane Jacobs, The Economy of Cities, that Bodie gives me to.
I think I recommended that to you 35 years ago.
Oh, at least, yeah. So I think that's probably the one thing in economics that had the most impact on me. I think of Jane Jacobs as the leading economist of the 20th century. She's amazing.
When did she pass?
Fairly recently, I think.
Yeah, so
I think maybe 8 to 10 years ago, anyway.
Yeah, okay, that's for me. My age was fairly recently.
Now, what about what about Neil Ferguson?
No, that's I don't think those. I mean, they're very good books, but again, I've learned that you need a particular kind of book for a good reading group, and I don't think his books really apply.
But let's look in terms of your book, in terms of your theory, in terms of the potential impact that it may have on economics.
Yeah.
Are you able to sort of talk about your approach and, let's say, the straightforward not so straightforward,
How
but
it-
the
how it-
economics, how it departs,
Yes.
how it, maybe you could go into that a little bit.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. I call it the conventional theory, or some people call it neoclassical. Others say, no, that isn't neoclassical. But I mean the economics you learn in class, textbook economics, okay, graduate school. And
Robert Solow.
Sorry?
Robert
No, that's a
Solow.
very small part of it. I mean, actually, more general equilibrium theory might be more
Okay.
emblematic of it. Okay. So there are three differences between my theory and that theory. I call mine the commerce predation theory. Okay. So the first difference I've mentioned already, okay, that conventional economics focuses on production. Okay. It's not that predation and commerce are absent. They're kind of there. Okay. So the conventional theory talks about the market. Okay, the market is what coordinates the economy, it provides the prices, but there's really no discussion whatsoever about what that is. Okay, it's really a disembodied spirit that magically provides, some people have said, this is a big failing, that we need to explain how these prices are actually determined and so on. So commerce is there as this disembodied spirit, but there's no discussion of it as an economic activity, okay? Which is weird because in our economy, a lot more people are employed in commerce than in production, okay? And the third economic activity is predation, which is closely related to government, okay? Government is the most important source of predation. So it's government, as Reagan said, government is the problem, okay? But it also can protect against predation, okay? If Napoleon had won the Napoleonic Wars, economic progress would not have gone well, okay? So the British government stopped that from happening, okay? The US government stopped Hitler and then Stalin. So that's kind of important. Okay, so government can also protect against predation. It's not only guilty of it, but also can protect. Again, government is present in conventional theory, but no, totally unreal. It's not. Again, it was a disembodied spirit.
But Mayor, in terms of economic growth,
yeah,
there tends to be an emphasis on technological change and innovation.
Right.
Such as.
So let me just finish setting up the differences, and we can come back to that. So one difference is commerce predation, production rather than just production. Okay. The second difference is we're talking about processes, not equilibrium. So conventional economic theory is a static equilibrium theory. Okay, and that isn't very useful for understanding the economic progress, okay, in my opinion, okay? Mine is a theory of processes, okay? Sort of like evolution, okay? It includes evolutionary processes, okay? So that's the second difference. And the third difference is sort of the model of the individual. So in conventional theory, some people have called it autistic economics because there's no eye contact between individuals, okay? Everyone gets the list of prices and they make their decisions and that's it, okay? They don't actually deal with other people in any way whatsoever. In case you're in any doubt, we're a highly social species and that's very important to the economy, okay? So understanding of the economy, you have to take those things into account, and in my theory, that's very much a part of things like the voluntary associations and so on. Okay, so those are the fundamental differences. Technological progress you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I mean,
no, it's not quite right. What Solow showed was that sort of the standard idea of progress as being capital accumulation doesn't really hold up. If you look at the numbers, it doesn't work, okay? And, even in theory, diminishing returns and all that kind of thing. Something else, okay, which got called the Solow residual. And yeah, I mean, I'm totally on board with that. And then a lot of people have interpreted that as meaning technological progress. But it isn't really a result. Okay, it's just sort of, well, it must be technological progress.
Mhm.
Okay.
Because of the focus on production in part.
Right. So my view of technological progress is it's hugely important, but it's endogenous. Okay, it's part of the process. Somebody said that about capital accumulation, that capital accumulation isn't the cause of growth, it is growth. Okay. In the same way, technological progress is part of economic progress. It's not, it sort of stimulates it and it's stimulated by it. Okay, it's sort of a reciprocal relationship.
Great. So when can readers, you think, maybe beyond us?
That's not nice asking that question.
Well, I think for our readers, for our listeners,
Yeah.
they can already read near the
Yeah,
whole.
on my website, I have a draft.
So you've democratized the reading process.
I've been working on that a lot. I mean, it's not just sort of presentation, I mean, substantively. So I've really sort of since then developed it a lot. And that's what's taking a lot of time.
Well, you were anticipating the trends which have now emerged because of the pandemic, where everybody's taking to the internet.
Yeah.
So
And that's had a big impact on commerce.
Preparing places for them to go.
Yes. Yeah.
I think another way you've anticipated it is the changing nature of commerce in the US.
Right. Yeah. It's actually been a big deal even recently. I mean, there was sort of a real growth spurt in the late 90s. And McKinsey, the power of productivity, attributes that to Walmart. Okay, not just Walmart itself, but what other retailers had to do to compete with Walmart. Okay, there were just huge developments in retail that put a lot of pressure on reducing costs and improving productivity.
But the Amazon phenomenon allows
that's the second one. Okay,
right, that allows
next
production in a way.
Next thing was Amazon. That's made a huge impact. Okay, people are wondering, where did inflation go? Well, a lot of it is retail prices have really been driven down by just as Walmart did in the 90s, but Amazon has had a big effect on that. So yeah, even today that's big. But also my definition of commerce is more than just retail. So finance is a branch of commerce, okay? Okay, commerce mediates exchange. That's what I mean by commerce, the mediation of exchange. Okay, economics generally recognize that exchange is really important and that's what it's all about. But the really big deal is the mediation of exchange. That makes it, that puts it all on steroids. If we actually had to deal with one another individually in exchange, things would be pretty poor. That's a subsistence economy, basically. And even actually, John Hicks has this book, The Theory of History, and he's one of the few economists that sort of gets this and says this. And he says the big thing is not exchange, but mediated exchange. That is what was the big transition. Okay, that's what starts the things growing much faster.
Can you distinguish that a little better for our listeners?
Sorry?
Can you distinguish that a little better for our listeners, meaning me?
Distinguish what?
Mediated exchange.
Oh, mediated exchange is when you get your stuff on Amazon and in the supermarket. Direct exchange is when you go to the farmer's market.
Okay.
And I was talking about finance. So a certain kind of exchange is borrowing and lending, providing finance and receiving finance. Okay, financing. Okay, and that's particularly difficult to do one-on-one.
Right.
Okay, and a branch.
Well, I recall Gurley and Shaw. They have a.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
didn't Gurley and Shaw have an insight on that?
I haven't looked at that recently. I think last I looked at it was in the 70s. So it is on my list of things to look at, but I don't really remember what they had to say. But that's enormously important. That has affected both the evolution of the economy and the evolution of government. Okay, so.
Well, Douglas North comes to mind.
Sorry?
Douglas North.
Yes.
Do you agree with his analysis?
I've read a lot of his stuff. It's been a while. He was, again, one of the formative influences on me. Some of his things I don't like as much. So, you know, the what's it called? The violence, social orders and violence thing. I thought that was not very good. I didn't like that for various reasons. But his earlier work I liked a lot and certainly influenced me. Yeah.
Well, we have about 15 minutes more.
Okay.
I'd like to maybe move from the evolution of the economy,
Yeah.
to the evolution of Meir Kohn.
Okay.
You started a little bit about some of your intellectual development. You can either expand on that, but I'm also interested in, and people may be also interested in, how did this happen? How did you become an economist? How?
Oh, okay.
And
so
your background in England.
Students,
thing.
I often have students in my office sort of asking about career advice and this sort of thing. And how did I get to be whatever? So I tell them it's kind of a Forrest Gump story. It all was by chance. I mean, it wasn't, that I decided at 16 that I was going to be a professor of economics somewhere. One thing led to another. So like Tzvi, I started off with kibbutz. Okay, he went from America to Israel. I went from England to Israel to join kibbutz.
We were young and idealistic.
Why did you do that? You recall?
Sorry?
You recall why you did it?
Yeah, of course I recall why I did. I did it because I didn't really feel at home in England. I didn't feel it was my country. And I was very impressed when my Israeli cousin came to visit, and he was just so comfortable with his identity in a way that I wasn't. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I should check this out. So I went, and one thing led to another. I joined a youth movement, as Tzvi did, which I became a socialist as a result.
True believer.
True believer. And I went to Israel to join a kibbutz. I had intended to study biology. That's what particularly interested me in school. And the kibbutz said, well, why don't you do applied biology? It's called agriculture. And I said, sure, yeah, okay. So I went to the Faculty of Agriculture. In
Rehovot.
In Rehovot, yeah. And I found that actually I didn't like biology. And
especially the applied type.
Yeah, no, what I liked was reading about biology, right? That I found it very interesting, but lab work and all this kind of thing was really not for me. And the one thing they really had there, other than biology, was agricultural economics. So that's how I got into economics, okay, as a refugee from biology. And then the Department of Agricultural Economics in Rehovot, people who did I continued to a master's, and people who did that generally went on to work in government. A lot of them in the Ministry of Defense, and that was sort of, I was just going along that track. And my professor said, well, why don't you go do a PhD in America, and then you can come back and teach. Wow, that was a concept. It had never occurred to me either. But the idea of going to America was really exciting. So that's what I did, and that's how I became a professor of economics.
And at MIT, how did you feel? How did you fit in at MIT?
Oh, I loved it. I thought it was really terrific. I was very good at math, so I was drawn into the sort of math. Then it was mathematical theory, also econometrics. I mean, I did econometrics. and I did computer programming. Okay, actually, I started that in Rehovot, and I actually paid my way through both undergraduate and graduate school with programming and with econometric work. So that was sort of things I did.
His master's thesis was a marketing scheme for citrus.
Yes, it was
involving
an algorithm called quadratic program.
right.
Okay, to decide where to send the oranges in Europe, which markets, when. Yeah.
Well, that was commerce in a way.
I guess so.
I wonder if they're still using your algorithm.
I don't know. I read something recently that altogether, the citrus is not such a big thing in Israel anymore.
Yeah, at one time it was the major export.
Yeah. So I think that sort of changed.
Yeah, well, now it's all a lot of IT.
Right. Yeah.
But also biology and health. There's a huge
Yes.
sector there as well.
Yeah.
So then you went to MIT and you came back to Israel.
Right.
How did you find teaching in Israel when you came back? And
fine. I mean, I didn't really have any objection.
you had some good colleagues there.
I had some very good colleagues there. Yeah. And I left because it wasn't just the pay of a lecturer at the Hebrew University was very low, and it was just very difficult for us to live on that.
Yeah, most professors moonlight.
Yeah. Well, that's how I met Bob, actually, was moonlighting at Brookdale.
Right.
Yeah, but that wasn't enough. That was a help, but it didn't get me over the top. So it was largely economic reasons that I, just had difficulty making a living. There were other things. I had political issues as well, these sorts of things.
And as you were going to Dartmouth and teaching, I understand you had some evolution in your teaching process.
Absolutely, yeah. So teaching for me had been a chore. Okay, it was basically what you did to get paid so you could do your research, which was really what was interesting.
I think that's true for quite a few.
Yeah, no, that's not unusual.
Not just economists even.
But what happened was, like as in my research, I just didn't do what everybody else was doing. I sort of changed the way I taught because it seemed that the standard way of doing it, the talk and chalk thing, seemed like a total waste of time. When I was a student, I never actually went to the classes because I didn't learn anything from them. I read the textbook and prepared for the exam and did fine. So I tried to, when I wrote a textbook, they were from my lecture notes. I mean, I've been doing the talk and chalk. I thought, why, if they can read it, why do I have to do it in class? So I switched to essentially a Socratic method, okay, where it was sort of all dialogue. I'd just give assignments and then I'd ask them questions about them in class. And that was really fun. That was really interesting. I think they learned much more from it. And I actually got to like teaching. When I did it that way, it was really quite enjoyable and interesting. And I think much more successful. I mean, I think the students learned a lot more from it.
Yeah, aren't you ranked way up there at the top of popular teachers?
I don't know. I mean, there's not an official ranking. There are people who have said good things about my teaching.
Well, the students, I think there's a revealed preference there for.
Yeah, that too. So, yeah. Although, Wall Street has something to do with it. The attraction is not just Meir Kohn, it's also where this leads. Yeah.
That's they've got to pay off those high Dartmouth tuitions. And,
right. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Now, you are still giving some other talks. Maybe you can, we don't have a lot of time, but I'd like you to give the sort of short version of talked about communism and capitalism.
Okay.
And you talked about externalities, but let's start with the communism and capitalism.
You want that in 5 minutes? Yeah.
Well,
Okay. Well,
I'm
remember,
confident you can do it.
my basic economic activities are, you have to have production, okay, or you don't eat. So that's sort of the basic thing. Then in addition, there's commerce and predation, okay? You can combine these in different ways to get different basic types of economy. So in a subsistence economy, there's production and not much else, okay? There's not any significant commerce. There may be some predation, but not really organized. You certainly don't have predatory governments or anything like that. It's pretty, poor. You can put on top of that a predatory government, okay? And that became possible with sedentary agriculture, when people couldn't run away from you, or it was costly to run away from you. You could establish control over a territory and collect tribute. That I call a tribute economy, okay? And more sophisticated tribute economies, as quite early on in China, most of the tribute is in labor. Okay, so like when the Jews were slaves in Egypt, they weren't slaves, they were performing corvée labor, which is what predatory states.
What's that first word?
Sorry? Corvée labor, yeah, that's the name for it. But you're conscripted to work. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that an English word, or is it a name of
That's like
something?
French. It has an acute accent on one of the E's.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. So that's a tribute economy. That's one of the other basic kinds. There's not much commerce, essentially, in that kind of economy. To cut to the chase, communism is like that. Communism is not something new. It's a tribute economy. In China, it's kind of obvious because they have 2,000 years of tribute economies. They kind of escaped and then went back several times. And the last time they went back was in 1949, Mao communism. And I've told this story to Chinese students and they say, yeah, I mean, the last time it happened was the first Ming Emperor. They say the first Ming Emperor was Mao's big hero. Okay, so Mao was quite conscious of this, that this was not a new form of government. This was something very traditionally Chinese that he was reestablishing. That's a tribute economy.
But in the last 20 or 30 years, China has really developed.
Right, so the history of China is repeatedly the tribute economy. The government has weakened. Commerce has naturally popped up because it was allowed to. The government was no longer suppressing it. And you have a period of significant economic progress. The Sung period, the late Ming Qing period, which actually continued into the early 20th century. And then they've always gone back until now, okay? So when you look at developments in China today, you want to be aware of the history of this. Okay, and you can see Xi is kind of, leaning in that direction. Okay, he doesn't want to give up the goodies. That was sort of like the Sung dynasty that commerce can provide, but he wants to control it, and that doesn't end well.
Right.
In the past. And then the third kind of economy is production plus commerce. Okay, that's a commercial economy. That's what we call a market economy. That's what we call capitalism. And again, it's not new, okay? In the early Roman Empire, it looked a lot like that. In ancient Athens, it looked a lot like that. So there have been examples going back a long period of time. So that's my story about communism and capitalism, that's the distinction, and neither of them is something new. They're both very sort of ancient things that have just reappeared. Okay.
Well, we're almost at a 1 hour point.
Yes.
I think we can try to conclude with some things. Tzvi, what would you like to ask?
Well, I'd like to see the book.
So would I.
Got to encourage him to.
Yeah, you've got internet,
than me when it's
an internet connection, Tzvi, so you can read it that way. I'm hoping that we have more of these kinds of very enlightening discussions. And I'm not sure that who can stand up to your very outstanding insights.
The two kinds.
They're both grounded in thought and as well as historical narrative and description, which are very well written. I encourage all our listeners before, to get a quick glance.
Yeah, by the way, you've got to create a YouTube channel, a Meir Kohn YouTube channel. Yes. So that people can go to it and participate in whatever you choose to record.
Okay, well, when I finish the book, I'll think about that. I'll ask you.
No, but I mean the things that you do with students. Those.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Because it was interesting. I listened to what you had to say about power of productivity or something like that.
Right.
Whatever that book was.
Yeah. It's worth reading. But I'm also aware, I've long felt that the term intellectual and scholar is too widely applied. But one person
Thought leader
really applies to
one that is too
Meir Kohn.
Oh,
And for that, I really thank you, Mayor.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good place to sign off. And again, thanks for.
Okay, thank you very much.
Econ Chat.
And our sign off is sei gesund.
Okay, sei gesund.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, let me see. Pause. Stop recording. Stop.